There we go.
Okay. Hi everybody, hello and welcome to this month's AWS user group. And this is a monthly occurrence thing, so if you're new to the AWS user group, where have you been? If you have been to the AWS user group before, welcome back. I haven't been to the AWS user group for a number of months. Sorry, Paul. My name is Derek, by the way. I work for AWS. I'm a developer advocate across Australia and New Zealand. And it's my pleasure to introduce our speaker for tonight. Before I do, I'd just like to remind you that we also have a accompanying meetup, not AWS, but a really interesting meetup tomorrow, Data Engineering Bites, which is over in Flux. So if you like what you see here, we also have that happening tomorrow. Okay, so without any further ado, I'd like to introduce the speaker for tonight, Monsieur Ricardo Sueiras, who is all the way from London. Ricardo and I, we work together in the developer relations team, doing a lot of talking, a lot of writing, and a lot of recording. So Ricardo is the expert on AWS open source globally, and I'm building you up.
You are.
Yeah. And so today he's going to take you through all of the things and what's top of mind when thinking about open source on AWS. So I hope you enjoy it. Thank you. Ricardo.
Thank you. I'm not sure about the monsieur though, because I'm Spanish, so it should be señor.
I tried.
But you know, so thank you very much, Derek, for that introduction. Yes, I do work in open source. I've been working in open source for over 20 years, ever since I was building web infrastructure, and instead of using Netscape, iPlanet, that came up in a conversation earlier on, we were trying to figure out how to do it cheaper. And I discovered HTTP server. And this is the cool thing that you could actually sort of download the source code, compile, and run it. And it was just amazing. And interestingly, the person who actually was responsible for the documentation now works in the open source team. So I get to work with the guy who built all the documentation that I used to use. So it's pretty sort of fortuitous. So what can you expect today? So I've got a talk that's in two parts. The first part is going to level set and kind of bring up to speed what open source is, because when I speak to developers, they have some idea of the picture, but not all of the picture. And then I'm going to switch and talk about how AWS thinks about open source, and so hopefully you'll see the two talks come together. So that's kind of what you can expect. Cue fancy transition if it works. Nope, it doesn't. That's why. Whoa. That's the only one, right? Yeah, that is the only one. So I'm going to first of all start off with open source. What is it? Okay, and so what do all of these have in common? Now, actually, I did change this picture specifically for this audience because I didn't have a clue what that was, and that's apparently a ute, and apparently that's a thing to drive if you're here. So what do these all have in common? Oh yeah, that's not bad. So okay, anything else on that? So effectively, they're all open source. They all contain open source software components, GPL potentially, so your humble washing machine, which these days seems to want to connect to the internet. If you go to the user manual, I bought one recently. Unbelievably, it's got pages and pages of open source license. And this car here, which isn't a particular a modern one, I don't think, I managed to find the user manual, right, online. And in the user manual, it's got a section about open source software. So open source software is everywhere. But we can go all the way back to the Industrial Revolution, right, to find the roots of actually the kind of open source. And what used to happen in those days, those dark days, when they were building mills and pumps to get tin out of the ground. So actually it's quite relevant, actually. I didn't realise this was going to be so well aligned to the community. One of the problems is that it was really expensive and really hard to build these things. There wasn't like the internet, then. And so what would happen is they would build one of these things at great expense, with a long time. And then they would go on tours around the UK at universities and share their experience. They share their designs. And then what would happen is that all the engineers, the students would say, why didn't you do it this way? Well, you could have done it better that way. And over a very short period of time, the efficiency of these things, these mills, these iron furnaces, improved significantly. And this was being driven actually by kind of the government, who wanted to kind of like increase the production of steel, tin, and these materials. So, in the DNA of engineers to kind of share and collaborate to improve the things that we're working on. Kind of how this relates to kind of code is if we look at a timeline. So this is a timeline through font design. So up until 1974, there was no copyright on source code or binary code, which meant that if you were a developer back in the days of the IBM mainframes or DEC, you could write code and you can share it with people, and there'll be no big issue. In fact, actually, that's what happened. Academics and hobbyists would get together. Share was the very first user group run by IBM. Anyone was a part of that today? No. I'm probably just about old enough for that. But what happened is in 1974, the Copyright Act was changed to include source code. And then later on, binary as well. And that changed everything. It changed so that software development changed from a hobbyist academic activity to a commercial activity. And what then ensued was this big investment in effectively commercializing software, packaging it, selling it, and not letting everyone have the source code. And so there was one particular person who, bless you, whose name I shall not mention because I don't particularly like this person, but this person created the Free Software Foundation because he felt it was a fundamental right to have source code to the kind of the software that they were using. Kind of fast forward a few years, then what happened was that a book, Eric Raymond wrote, actually another guy who was not particularly a nice chap, he wrote a book called The Cathedral and the Bazaar, which looked at software development in this free software ecosystem and compared two particular open source software development methodologies, so the Cathedral and the Bazaar, so kind of very small communities versus top down. And from that, he created the term open source. And they kind of both do similar things, but free software comes from this kind of fundamental four freedoms that the Free Software Foundation believes that all software should meet, right? So the ability to kind of run, copy, modify, distribute. Kind of underlying that is actually this kind of tenet, which is the ability to reproduce from the source code any software. And the open source is slightly different. It has these 10 characteristics that any open source license needs to meet. And kind of open source evolved because it was more business friendly. People thought that free software was a bit too hippie, a bit too kind of like philosophical, and people who were really passionate about this wanted businesses to adopt it. And it took OSI really to kind of make that happen. And so what evolved over the years that happened was a group of like 70 plus licenses that all met that criteria as a group, the OSI, that meet over email distribution chains. And they decide whether a license that's submitted meets the criteria or not. And so we have things like Apache, BSD, MIT, and loads of others, right? I'm not going to go into the details. But the kind of underlying principle that's really important for developers is it allows developers to create, distribute, and consume software without having to ask permission or having to negotiate. And this is a real big problem before then, because anyone who used to work in software back in that day would know that if you wanted to kind of use a piece of software, you'd have to go to your legal team. Can I use this? If you didn't have a relationship with that kind of company that had the code, you'd need to figure out where it came from. Can I use this? And it was a real drag and slowdown in actually building software. But ultimately what this meant was software was actually more predictable. And so this is what really kind of sort of turbocharged software development. And this is why when we look today, 80, 90%, depending on who you speak to, of all applications contain open source software. So that's kind of the history. But when you look at about kind of what it is today, we have these kind of 4 pillars of open. The first one, which is kind of what I've touched upon, which is open source. Then we have open design, open kind of development, and then open community. So I'm going to just touch upon what these are. So open source is anyone talks about open source is any software that is distributed under an OSI approved license. Llama is not, right? And it's an absolute killer. You know, a lot of us have been trying to fight that, but they're not interested. But in reality, how you can kind of picture this is that when you write software, there's like a rights continuum. On one hand side, it's like the kind of your super secret stuff, the stuff that the formula for Coca-Cola, that kind of thing. And on the other side is the public domain stuff that is literally given away. Now, when you write a piece of software today, okay, and you put it on GitHub, by default, that is proprietary code. It's where the arrow is pointing down. You as a developer can make it open source by applying a license file to it. And you can, there's over 70, and the different types of licenses kind of fall loosely in 2 camps. Those that are reciprocal, that have obligations. So for example, if you use this, fine, but if you make some improvements, I want you to give those improvements back to everyone. Or the more permissive, which is basically, I don't care, just use it as you want. Sometimes they'll say, can you reference it? Sometimes they won't care, right? And this is policed by a group called the Open Source Conservancy. So if people try and do naughty things like companies have done over the past few years, these are the folks that will take you to court and sue you and win normally. So that's kind of that's the kind of the enforcement of it. But increasingly we're being asked, what about data and graphics? Can you open source these things? Well, the answer is no. Okay, there are other open source like licenses that you can use to data. But the kind of key one, which is actually this is a new slide that we added today after speaking to Derek. The OSI is working on this, not as quickly as they should, in my opinion. But it has got some interesting connotations. So the Apache Foundation put this out on their website, right? So last year in October, the US Copyright Office issued an announcement saying that the output of generative AI cannot be copyrighted. Now think about that for a second, okay? If you are using generative AI to write a story, write some music, write a picture, create a picture, or write some code, you cannot apply copyright to that. Imagine you're a startup, right? And you've got this really good idea, and you've built it all using generative AI. And this is why on the Apache website, they say the output of generative tools cannot be seen as your work. And one of the kind of requirements when you're contributing to Apache projects, it's got to be your work. So you cannot, therefore, by kind of extension, contribute code using these tools to Apache projects. Okay, so it's an interesting conundrum. And it kind of leads us to this kind of question, which we don't have any answers for at the moment, is if you're using generative AI, where on that right spectrum is this code gonna sit? So I don't have any answers for you, but it's definitely something interesting for you to talk about. If you're using these tools, I know I am. I know Derek is. We all are, in fact, probably. Actually, show of hands, who here is using generative AI tooling in development? Okay, it's not as many as I thought, but a few. Okay, right. So for those people who put their hands up, noodle on that for a minute. Okay, so that's open source, right? That's the thing that hopefully is the kind of foundation of open source. But there's also other aspects, okay? So the next one is open design. And this is where when you build software, how do you actually build it in a way that is transparent and open to the community, right? And so what this means is that typically you need to have within the open source project a governance model. One of the things that I've done in the past before I joined AWS was I used to help companies create strategies for open source, and that included, for example, if you build some software, how do people know how to interact and use this? How do they know how to contribute changes? How do they know how to do all these other things? And one of the kind of this is the broad sort of area of things that you typically have to think about. But one of the key ones is making sure that your project adopts a code of conduct. Because ultimately we are dealing with people, developers, And as you know, developers are tetchy, opinionated. Who's tabs here? Who likes tabs and who likes spaces? Tabs, hands up. You are my people. Spaces, the rest of you, oh, no. Okay, we're up. Yeah. So we could have technologists, developers are famous for their religious wars, right, and flame wars, and this definitely occurs in open source projects. So you need to make sure that as part of your governance model, you've got from the start these kind of code of contacts to keep everyone in check, and we'll come back to this one later on. So open development, actually. So once you've now got an open governance and you understand, you've laid the law down of how this project's going to go forward, the next thing is actually making sure that it's easy for everyone to understand how to develop your open source project. So things like, is it easy to understand how to make a contribution? Is there a build system that allows you to build the software? And it's surprising, actually, how many open source projects get this wrong. And when you like a piece of software, open source project, you go to it and you have no idea how to get it started on your local machine, how to even contribute, what are they looking for? But some projects do it better than others. So I've written about Apache Airflow, which is my talk for tomorrow, the data engineering, so shout out for that. So the Apache Airflow project is incredibly welcoming. They do all the right things. They make it really easy to contribute. They make it really easy to get started. They've got a whole cohort of people that welcome newbies. It's amazing. I mean, if every project could do what they do, I think we'd be on a happy path. But during this development phase, this is where you now have to watch out. And this is where you have to enforce your code of conduct, because boy, it can get spicy, right? But it's important, if you've got a code of conduct, that you do stick to it. So you need to make sure if you are involved in a project, that you understand how you're going to do that. Now, as part of development, there's this thing called a contributor agreement, CLA, CDOs. Now, these are very controversial. Hands up if anyone here has signed or uses these at all. Anyone? No. Okay. So some projects, okay, before you make a contribution, they will ask you to sign something. And this is called a CLA or CDO. Now, kind of the pretext for this is for the project to protect themselves that your contribution is not plagiarized, okay? It's not stolen from somewhere else, okay? But typically what happens is that it also transfers the rights, some of the rights you have onto the project. So typically, in a normal project, if everyone here was contributing, and you all made one contribution, you would all own the copyright for your contribution. Let's say this project was mine, if I want to then relicense from an open source to an non-open source stuff, I would have to ask all of you to agree to that. And the chances are that some of you probably would not, okay? But the CDO and the CLAs provide projects the ability to do that without asking you, which is why they're controversial, right? And if you look at recent relicensing, that's how they've managed to do it. This is something you need to be thinking of, whether you do use this or you don't use this in your project. And kind of the final pillar is the open community, because when you think about open source projects, the heart of open source projects really is the people in them. And we kind of think about trying to make sure that projects are welcoming, because projects are trying to grow from the point of view of people who use them, but also convert the people to, as many of those people, to be more active contributors in the project. But also, more importantly, they're trying to get more diverse views on that piece of project, because if you're trying to use a piece of software in one small group, it might work well for you, but then another group will use it and think, well, they haven't thought about X, Y, and Z. So this is why when you talk about open community, it's about trying to get as broad a set of insights and inputs, different skills, different backgrounds, so that you can make your project much more broadly appealing. And ultimately try and kind of go to this thing where you increase the outbound, growing more users, and then you convert some of those to contributors and some of them to maintainers. So, kind of just to sum up, okay? So, open source is actually more than just a license, okay? It has these four pillars. You can choose just to use one, which is the open source piece, and not do the others, right? But then you're not really kind of like utilizing the maximum impact of open source. And so really, this is why when we look at open source projects, how well they're doing can be determined by how much effort and how well aligned they are to the 4 pillars. Also, as a company, it helps you plan how much effort, because I was at a very big a German car manufacturer, helping them with their open source strategy, and they hadn't realized about the 4 pillars, and they hadn't realized how much effort, and that allowed them now to start resourcing headcount on open sourcing one of their projects. Right, okay. So that's the 4 pillars, that's open source. All good so far? We're all open source experts?
Can you just summarize the 4 pillars?
So open source, the license, open design,
Yeah.
open development,
Yeah.
and open community.
Open community, that's the
Yeah.
one. Thank you.
So people, sort of development, governance, the rules, and then the license, pretty much. And kind of like, it's quite fluid, you know, but that's kind of broadly speaking when you can like, you know, and not all projects are doing that. That's the key thing, right? So most projects, the ones that you might do, will probably just do one, the license, right? And no, because you don't care, right? But other projects who want to grow, right, who've got aspirations of being the next, you know, Kubernetes, this is where they need to focus, right? So what does this mean for us at AWS? Okay, and how do these pillars relate to that? So that's actually now what I'm going to talk about. And in order to understand that, so I've been at Amazon 6 years. And I think what I've noticed is that the way that we do open source is very strongly aligned to the Amazon leadership principles. Who is familiar with the Amazon leadership principles? Put your hand up. A few. Right, for those that aren't, Amazon leadership principles are a set of 16 things that we have on a website that pretty much govern how we interact, behave, how we're hired. And it kind of almost acts as like an abstraction language within the org, right? And it helps us understand how to communicate with each other. And it starts off with customer obsession as the most important one. And I can't even remember what the last one is. I think it's something to strive to be the world's greatest something. But anyway, most of them are really good, right? Most of them are really good. But they do help actually, or they help me understand when I've been speaking to the open source folk within the organization, how we do open source, because we do it in a very different way to how I've seen other people do it. And so the first one, as I've mentioned, is customer obsession. And this is like the most important. You know, you'll hear the phrase "working backwards from the customer" quite a lot if you've been to any AWS event. But what it actually means is that, you know, and when we apply it to technology, is that our roadmap is driven by feedback from customers. Sometimes that's direct, sometimes it's indirect. And what I mean by that is sometimes we look between the lines, we'll see patterns, we'll see behaviors, and we will act upon that. And another kind of aspect of customer obsession is choice. Now, we know customers love choice, and everyone has got their own situation, and delivering the product the same way is not going to work for all customers. And then the other thing is that we know customers have a lot of pain points when it comes to using technology. So we combine these in how we approach open source. And one of the ways, so again, another plug for Apache Airflow, is how we decide when we want to build a managed service. Okay, so Apache Airflow is a managed service which we released, I think, in 2020. I think it's a few years anyway. Yeah, 2021. Can't remember. I should know, but I don't. And it came basically because customers were telling us that, you know, they love Apache Airflow, and some of them started off running it themselves. Okay, they realized that actually running Apache Airflow is hard, right? And they would really love a managed service. But even though we built a managed service, which actually is this slide here, right? We built a managed service to make it easier for people to do it. What they also told us, okay, and I do cover this in my talk tomorrow, is that sometimes, you know, managed service is good, but, we want a bit more control, right? Because we like control, right? Who likes control? Who likes control? Exactly, yeah. Yeah, I know I do. And so effectively, what they want from us is not to be left completely alone. They want an opinionated set of resources that allows them to run their own Apache Airflow, but provide everything provided by AWS. So we've got a project called Data on EKS that's awesome. It uses Terraform to build Apache Airflow to production quality. So whether you want managed service or whether you want to run it yourself, you've got options. But also what we found when we were speaking with customers is that there was this kind of pain point that wasn't being articulated around how they actually reduced issues when they were going to production. So we open sourced this project called WAR Local Runner, which allows you to run a configuration identical version locally on your laptop to our managed service, which means that now developers can actually test everything locally, shift left, shift far, far left, and reduce the amount of times that they take out their Apache Airflow environment, which still is very common. Okay, so customer obsession, first LP. So if anything as well today, apart from open source, you're learning about Amazon LPs, right? So, right, so the next LP I want to talk about is invent and simplify, which is how we try and make customers' lives easier by making things simple. And when I first started working in open source, kind of one of the things that we saw was that initially customers weren't taking. So back in the late 90s, early 2000s, open source was a dirty word. No one would use it. No one trusted it. No one had confidence in it. You couldn't get support. All these kind of issues came up. But what's happened over the last 20 years is slowly now we've managed to build confidence and build trust. And part of that actually is because AWS was built on open source technology, right? So Zen, Tomcat, so S3 was driven by Tomcat, and loads of other really cool open source software. And of course, when you're running at that scale, what it means, it suddenly changes. It changes now, okay, this software works really well. It can scale much faster and harder than we thought we could. That combined with the financial crisis and an onus on financial pressures was a big kind of catalyst for now people deciding, do we really need that Oracle database, or can we move to Postgres? I actually was building, so this came up yesterday when I turned into the office. I bonded with Rachel over WebSphere, IBM WebSphere. I did a lot of work in IBM WebSphere, and I was beginning to write papers around, you know what, we're only using 5% of IBM WebSphere. Why don't we move to Tomcat? And that was pretty much the beginning. Because when you think about it, if you're running any piece of software, right, those are all the things. This is not an exhaustive list, just a very quick summary. There's a lot of stuff you've got to do. Wouldn't it be really great, right, if we could invent and simplify and just make it so that you only have to do the top bit? Which is why we've created a whole bunch of open source managed services around a whole bunch of open source technologies. There's only a small selection. And I think I've updated Valkey. Is Valkey there? No, I haven't put Valkey there, but Valkey, obviously. Valkey's the new hot thing. We're not going to say the R word, are we, Derek? Yeah, exactly. Yesterday, I couldn't say Valkey. I could only say the R word. Now today, I've got it in the head. So we're trying to make it simple for customers to use as open source software. But again, we still got the choice. They can still run it the way. But another way that we're trying to simplify is actually helping customers move from proprietary software to open source. So we create a whole bunch of tooling to help people move from Windows to Linux, from SQL Server to Postgres, all that kind of stuff. So we can start, helping build and simplifying their life, moving from proprietary to open source. The next LP is around insisting on highest standards. When you're running open source at scale, you see bugs that no one else has seen. So Lucene powers the Amazon retail search. And Mike McCandles, who's one of the maintainers of Lucene, has got loads of really great blog posts. And on many of them, he says, we saw this bug. And this bug is an outlier, and it only happens because when you're being searched at like 100 million search requests per second, then it generates this error. So, we have developers who are working on these open source projects at this scale. So the same thing is true for Amazon OpenJDK, so Amazon Corretto. We see bugs that no one else sees at the scale, and then we submit pull requests to fix those so that no one else has those issues. Another area where we insist on the higher standards is security. So security is kind of our most important priority. And so these kind of like this is the way we think about open source security. So I can't even remember them actually. So the first one is actually like with OpenJDK, with Postgres and other projects, we have engineers working upstream in those projects. The second one is around how we provide tools. I've got a next slide that talks about some of the tools. And then the final one is actually how we are investing money, real money, to kind of rebuild some of the tooling and also fund some of the foundations that are doing some of the really cool supply chain security stuff. So here are some of the tools that we released last year. So SnapChain is a fuzzer that allows you to check and identify kind of bugs in your code. I got to be honest with you. I tried doing the tutorial and I didn't understand it, but apparently it's very cool. Postgres trusted language extensions. If anyone's using Postgres and using plugins, then this allows you to use plugins safely. And it's open source, so anyone can run it themselves. You don't have to use RDS to do this. I know Neon, for example, use it in their serverless Postgres. It's a really good, really cool project. And then cryptographic libraries, which are using formal reasoning to prove correctness and security, such as S2N, provide the kind of underpinnings for things like cryptographic operations. So these are all open source by AWS, and we use them, but other people use them as well. And we also provide funding for companies like Proximo to basically rebuild tools like sudo in Rust. Okay, so that basically improves security for everyone, because I mean, sudo is one of the fundamental tools, but there are other tools as well that we're like this libcrypt one in Rust. So that's kind of like the open source piece. But let's look at design now, right? And another one of my favorite LPs is Earn Trust. And I think it was last year. So the Open Invention Network, OIN, is a foundation that was set up many years ago to pool patents from companies. So you basically, as you're a company, you donate your patents, and it guarantees that no one will come after you. And so last year we joined that, and we donated all our patents to provide safety and assurance to customers who are using those patents, mainly in Linux in this instance, but there's other areas as well. We do open governance with projects like OpenSearch. So there's a blog post here where we have OpenSearch is the fork, the open source fork of Elasticsearch. And the governance model for that contains people from AWS, but also from other companies as well. So open development. So here the LP is ownership, and one of the key aspects of ownership, and as it appears to Amazon culture, is this concept of one-way and two-way doors. So two-way doors are things you can do that you might take some time, money, but you can always come back from. One-way doors are those decisions, those big things that really are hard to come back from. So building like a new facilities fulfillment center is a one-way door, right? Now, interestingly, at AWS, we treat open source as a one-way door, not a two-way door. And so what that means is if someone wants to create an open source project within AWS, we ask them how are they going to resource this for the next 5-10 years? What's the investment they've got? Where's the money coming from? Where's the people? And so that's kind of like how we think about it. So we don't look at it as a short-term activity. And what we're trying to do is we're trying to kind of increase the right-hand side of driving up our own contributions to kind of the open source project. And we've seen this more recently in how we kind of reacted to the making proprietary the R word and creating with the community Valkey. So this is Madden Olsen. She's been a long-term contributor to Redis, and she actually created a fork, I think the day or after they changed the license, did their rug pull, and it wasn't called Valkey. She called it some other name. And now it's formally a Linux Foundation project with a whole bunch of companies. So Snap, Oracle, Microsoft, Google, Ericsson, Avon, and a few others. But we're doing this in other projects as well. So CEDAR is a open source authorization library. Oh. And Derek did a fantastic talk on this at Latency a couple of weeks ago. So ask Derek to do the talk here in the future, right, if you're interested. So this is a really, really cool project. And again, it shows our long-term commitment to security. Anyone can use this in their own applications to build next generation authorization. Or if you want, you can use the managed services. So Amazon Verify Permission kind of like makes it simple for you, but you've got the choice, right? You can do that yourself. Another way we're earning trust in this is how we're doing work upstream in OpenJDK. So we had a brief conversation about this. So Amazon is a big Java shop. 80% of our stuff is Java. I could do a whole talk on this alone, right? But we realized a few years ago that we needed to create a distribution of OpenJDK, Amazon Corretto. And the team works completely upstream. So it's not a fork of OpenJDK. We work upstream and then produce a distribution in the same way that you can have other distributions of JDK. But we're in this for the long term, so we support all the long-term support of OpenJDK. And we also produce a whole bunch of other open source projects. I'm not going to go into all of them, but there are some kind of cool ones. So I used to use Docker on my Mac. I now use Finch. It's a really cool project. It works 95% of the time, which... So what I mean by that is that there's one, I think the hyphen compress is a parameter that doesn't work. But apart from that, everything else is solid. It uses, under the covers, it uses Lima and Nerd Control and a few other bits and pieces. But it's a really nice project. And I've not had any issues that stop me doing or moving to this on my laptop. If you use Kubernetes and you're looking for a very efficient autoscaler, Carpenter allows you to do that. And then we've got projects like Firecracker, which is a micro VMM open source thing. Now, one of the really interesting things I've seen people do with this is optimize their CI/CD pipeline. So rather than spinning up a VM to run their build system, they refactored it to run on Firecracker, and they were able to significantly reduce the time it took to do their builds. Now, Firecracker wasn't designed to do that, but the fact it's open source and the fact that anyone can use it means that we're seeing interesting use cases like that emerge. And then finally, open community. So at Amazon, we hire builders like Derek and myself, and a large number of these are already working deeply in the open source communities and projects. This is just a small selection of the folk we have and the projects that either they're maintainers for or significant contributors for. But we also contribute financially by supporting these foundations. This is only a small selection. There's many foundations, including recently the MariaDB Foundation. And we now have contributors to MariaDB. And also we're doing a lot of work in the Postgres community. I was lucky enough at FOSDEM to meet our Postgres community. I didn't realize how big they were and some of the cool stuff they're working in with Postgres 16. But we also support events, right? So we're at open source events. And one of the things that we like to do is we like to showcase the projects that our community are creating. So Derek and myself, we used to have a show, in fact, that's the next slide, where we used to feature open source developers, not from AWS, from other, actually we did feature a few people from AWS, didn't we? But mostly these are developers who are creating really cool open source projects that solve real pain points for our customers, and we help give them eyeballs and awareness so that they can get their own success. So the last leadership principle I'm going to talk about is think big. And over the last 20 years, we use a lot of open source projects within AWS, but we also contribute a lot back to those open source projects. We're probably guilty of not maybe communicating some of that as well as we could, but we are doing a lot of work there. So what does this actually mean then, and why ultimately does AWS care about open source? So this is kind of like the slide that the open source team produces, and in effect the reason that drives this is that as a customer obsessed company, we know that open source is everywhere. We know that our customers are using it, and by extension that means that we also need to care about open source. What was interesting, it was when we had the Log4Shell, which was a few years ago. People familiar with the Log4Shell exploit? Yeah. The reason why it caught our attention was because we had kids who were talking about their Minecraft server suddenly not being available because of something called Log4Shell. And that, going back to the slide with the cars, right? Java and Log4Shell is everywhere, and open source is everywhere. And so because of that, we care deeply about that. So this is the slide, Derek. So this is David Nally. I have the privilege of working with him. He heads up the open source team at AWS. He's also, in his side hustle, he's also the president of the Apache Foundation. Really great guy. And kind of this talk really is to help educate people about how we're doing open source, and for all of you to help us really join the open source fight. I have an open source newsletter. This is the only pitch I'm going to give you today, that I share about open source stuff, and it's for a developer audience, so no marketing stuff. It's code, projects, and stuff I find interesting, not necessarily maybe the marketing or business people find interesting, but the stuff I find interesting. And so with that, I am happy to take questions. Those are my social details. But one thing that I would love, and for the first, 20, there's a $25 AWS credit voucher. It's a small survey. I think it's 10 questions or 11 questions that will help us answer, or help us plan for the future of open source, better open source future. And so with that, I don't know how I've done for time, Derek, but I've got questions. So questions on open source. I'm sure people have got some questions.
I've got a question.
Oh, okay, I'm not sure who's first. So who was first out of you two? Was it? Okay.
I was looking at various open source platforms and the licensing of those open source platforms, and there's, like, as you mentioned, the permissive licensing, and then there's copyleft and the I'm just catching up with the acronym, AGPL version 3.
Yep.
Is there any reason why one would be adverse to the copyleft?
So, okay. So the question was there's different licenses, and how are they adverse to each other?
Yeah, or from a selection point of view, should one avoid one style of licensing versus the other?
Yeah, so this is actually a very common pitfall that a lot of projects fall into, right? So there are broadly three camps, right? There are free and permissive licenses. There are weak reciprocal licenses. I don't like to use the word copyleft. Reciprocal is how so that's what I mean. And then you have like what we call extreme reciprocal licenses, where they want you to include everything, including the kitchen sink, in your licensing. Now, as a project, so on one hand, on one side, we have the project, and as projects, as I mentioned in the 4 pillars, one of your goals is to grow your project, grow users, grow people who want to use your project. On the other camp are people who want to use your project, and they're thinking about legal repercussions. They're thinking about obligations based on the license. So what we find is that people over here want to protect their source code, right? People over here want to maximize their freedoms. So what happens is they typically, in my experience, they say, well, we love permissive licenses. We're okay with some reciprocal licenses, but we stay away from the extreme reciprocal licenses. So what happens is you get a situation where projects can they can have unintended consequences by going on an extreme license, and that is basically that no one uses their project, even though it's really good, right? Because ultimately it is a kind of choice for developers, right? And there's typically more than one thing that will do that thing that you want, and so then developers will choose based on license. And also, what we found, the research has shown that developers tend to gravitate to certain licenses. So, although I am noticing that AGPL is becoming more popular now, for sure. But again, that is a choice, it's a hard choice that a project's got to make, because they know straight away that they are probably cutting their market by a significant factor. So I hope that answers your question, sorry.
Does AWS actually contribute to projects in like OS distributions like Ubuntu, Red Hat, that kind of projects?
That's a good question. So the question was, do AWS contribute to distributions, open source distributions? Maybe you could.
I'm a Debian maintainer. I used to make the AMIs for AWS. And for the last 12 years, AWS has paid our bill, which includes CloudFront. So cloudfront.debian.net is about $15,000 a month. It's about $1.5 to $2 million worth of CloudFront that's been covered by AWS for the last decade and a half. And that's open to everybody. So if you're looking for an accelerated access to a repo, that's covered. The other thing that's helped us with is reproducible builds. So we can take source code, we can reproduce it on multiple architectures, and make sure that we come up with the same binary from the same source code, which has obviously been very useful over recent days. We talked briefly about XZ and a massive rebuild. A lot of the rebuild happens on AWS, and so that infrastructure is supported by AWS as well.
Wow,
so
sign him up.
Benefits from that. So we started that back in 2013 on AWS, and it still runs today.
Next question is Amazon Linux.
I don't run that.
Yeah, so that's a Fedora distribution. So we're obviously we're doing that work, right? So, but I think you touched upon a good point, right? So contributions. I didn't really talk about this in enough detail, but contributions. 34% of contributions are code, right? It's not the significant amount that makes open source work, right? Non-code contributions also are very significant. So writing blog posts, paying for infrastructure, supporting events. So when you talk about contributions, yes, code is important, but there's all the other bits as well that make the things happen. So so we have a team dedicated to building the Amazon Linux, and they support that obviously as well. Do they contribute back to the core projects? Absolutely. Cool.
Do you guys use AI to enforce the laws?
Do we use AI to enforce the
laws, the open source laws that people contribute?
So
what sort of areas you would use AI to help you manage the open source project, etc.?
So to my knowledge, we don't.
No one's interested.
So I'm not sure it's not that we're interested. I've just not seen it. It might be happening, but I'm just not familiar with it.
It's just that might be time consuming trying to enforce laws and things like that.
So yeah, I mean,
open source contributors are always overloaded, and there's a big burnout rate.
There is, but again, as I mentioned on my slide, the problem we've got is that open source contributions can't be copyrighted, right? So from a contribution perspective, there's still very much a grey area. From a back office perspective, around things like doing code scans, security scans, that's bound down to the tool being used. So we do use tools, right, for doing things like code checking and security scanning. If they use AI, then yeah, they will be using it. I'm just not overly familiar with the tooling, because again, one of the interesting things about Amazon is that we don't mandate standards, right? We have this two-pizza team model where we have small teams, and every team is allowed to do what they want. They use the tools they want, the processes they want, which means one team might use Scrum, another might use Waterfall. No, yeah. You never know. It could be coming back. But I think the point is that we don't enforce it. It's effectively it's a black box, right? As long as you maintain that API contract, we don't care. And that drives innovation within those teams to use new technologies, new ideas. So yeah, so unfortunately, I don't know if we're using AI.
Just curious.
Yeah.
I always think about this because Docker Hub is always a pain point for me. I wish that actually AWS public repository has a big adoption where there's a lot of contributors contribute to that.
To what? Sorry, to Docker.
Contribution of Docker containers.
Docker containers.
Yeah.
So we have got a public repository where we post them. I don't know whether we build them, but we have got a large number. So I always use now the ECR public repository now, not the Docker Hub. And like I said, I've switched away from Docker to Finch, and like I said, 95% it's there, and that's good enough for me. Because it's an open source project, I know. So at the moment, Finch works on Windows and Mac. It doesn't work on Linux, which is a killer. Yeah. But it's on the roadmap, and I know because I chase them all the time. So it's coming. So then that'll be 100%. So okay.
I was kind of curious about the generative AI copyright stuff. Like I kind of switch back and forth between building infrastructure and then doing data science and stuff. So I use Copilot a lot, basically, for reminding me how to format logs.
Yeah.
Yeah. But like, I can't imagine that basically, giving in a comment and then it spits you out on this XTIC format of yada yada whatever, and then you go back and rewrite it yourself once you know where to look. I can't imagine that would completely avoid any copyright on the entirety of the code.
So if you're using Copilot, I use Amazon Q, which is similar, to build CloudFormation templates or CDK apps. Then that's one thing. That's like it's code, but it's not like code in the sense of an application with IP, right? And like I said, it's not tested at the moment. What we know is that the US copyright law said that the output of these tools is not copyrightable, which means that you're using the stuff and you can use it, but anyone else can use it. What you can't do is you can't put your company's protection on the output. Now, for most people, they don't care, right? So it's not a big issue, but you have to go into that with your eyes open, is what I'm saying. Yeah, and we don't have any answers, right? It's so new. So yeah, that's one for discussions.
On CLAs and DCOs, was it? Developers?
Yeah.
You said that the key use case for those or purpose is to protect against things like plagiarism and so on, which is a valid necessity.
Yes.
Like that. But then obviously the other, or the coin to that, is that they're being used to relinquish developers of their rights to the copyright. So are there other mechanisms in place where you could implement one thing and not be a jerk?
Yeah.
Or is it just a matter of writing a nice guy CLA?
Yeah. So
For a CLA where it's like, please don't plagiarize.
you could do that. You absolutely could. So you could write a CLA, because CLA ultimately is up to you to define, right?
Yeah.
So you could absolutely define a CLA that basically is just on one focus. So with Amazon projects, we don't require CLA because we want you to retain all the copyright.
Sure. So
right.
how do you address plagiarism?
So we when you do the pull request in GitHub, there's a comment saying, by submitting this, you acknowledge that you are the owner of the IP. It's not. It's like a soft,
Sure.
like we're asking you to.
Isn't really enough to hold
Yeah.
legally.
So when the pull request is made, obviously the various scanning will happen, right?
Yeah.
Whether we implement a IP stroke check, I don't know. But that's one way you could do it. In the past, I've done that in other companies, right?
Yep.
So tooling exists to do that.
Yeah.
But unfortunately, it's quite expensive, right?
Of
But so if you wanted to move away from the CLAs and you had someone, a nice benefactor that could pay for that infrastructure, like Fortify or something like that, then you could do that. But yeah, good question. Sorry, yeah.
Ricardo, you spoke before about what an amazing 15, 16 years we've had for open source, starting with the Great Recession or global financial crisis, where a lot of companies started reevaluating whether proprietary software is right for them. We've also had, really low interest rates, so there's been a lot of VC money around funding a lot of the open source stuff. I'm not going to say the R word, but obviously, the change in the financial situation means that a lot of that VC money is drying up. So that's going to have implications for open source. So what do you see the next 15 years like for open source?
Yeah, that's a really good question. Okay, so what does this mean going forward, right? Are we going to see more rug pulls, right? So I don't think I included the I didn't include the slides actually because it was a bit provocative. Let me see if I can find it. Where is it? So yeah, so no single vendor, right? So what the incident, not just with Redis, but with Hashi and others, right, has put a laser focus on now projects. So they're calling it the Nebraska factor. And the Nebraska factor, has anyone seen the KCD comic? That basically has the pile of software, and then your entire software stack depends on this project maintained by some guy in Nebraska, right? And so we have in open source, the way we assess the health of projects, we have things called pony factor, elephant factor, and this allows us to measure by activities in the GitHub repository the number of contributions from different companies, the pull requests, all that kind of stuff. So we can start to dictate the health of projects, and this Nebraska factor is now effectively a new measure that we're looking at to see if we've got a risk from any projects that have a significant single vendor contribution. And because effectively we're seeing now is this term that single vendor open source projects are effectively the new proprietary. So what you'll start to see now is those projects will start to get much more scrutiny from developers because they're now a risk. So when I was at PwC, one of the things that I used to do a lot was help develop risk frameworks for using open source. So you effectively and most open source program officers have this, right? You have a criteria on which you assess how you use open source software. The stuff that's happened, I think the Redis was the kind of the cherry that on the top, and now everyone is looking at, okay, what's our risk impact? So I actually think the future is really good now because of it. Really weird, conversely, because now what the reaction from open source has been to double down on the Valkey project. VCs now, so this is my guess, only my guess, are now thinking we can't do this. This is not sustainable because if we do this, it's going to happen, and all our investment's going to go, right? So I think that looking ahead, it's not going to be a problem, and what will happen is that those projects that are single vendor, non-foundation projects, may start to struggle. So we'll see more projects going to foundations. Foundations will get more popular. So I think open source will definitely, or has got the mechanisms to protect itself against this. I'm not worried, to kind of summarize, because we've already got the mechanisms to solve this. What we're seeing is opportunists who are trying a few rug pulls, effectively, and they're getting away with it. But, it'll be interesting to see where Redis are in a few years' time, right? And where Hashi are. So the last year I've been speaking to developers about OpenTofu. I don't think I've been to a single meetup where, who put your hand up if you're Terraform users? Okay, a few. You don't have to share if you don't want to, but when I speak to developers over the last year, most are evaluating OpenTofu. So if you feel comfortable putting your hand up, and if you're evaluating OpenTofu, put your hand up. Okay, one, right, okay. So a lot of people are evaluating it, and what they're telling me is that they're waiting for the one big company to come out to give them confidence in making the move, right? So I think open source has got a lot of autonomic mechanisms to help heal itself, because it's quite a powerful force, right? So I'm not worried this is going to happen. I mean, it might happen again. We're already beginning to see mumblings of another big, I can't mention the name, big project that might do this. But I think that what's going to happen is developers now are going to use this Nebraska factor to assess projects and think, well, you know what, I'm not going to use that project now. I'm going to use that one, which is part of a foundation's got multiple vendors. And you'll also see more vendor projects go to foundations as well. So hopefully that answers your question.
So what was your thoughts on last year when Red Hat made that announcement where they software and decided to just pull the rug from the open source community to make their software now proprietary?
It's not proprietary, I don't think. So the question was around the thoughts of Red Hat's moved to remove source code from their distributions. I'm guessing that's what you're talking about. Yeah. So what happened was Red Hat used to make, they don't anymore, but they used to make all the source code available for their Red Hat Enterprise Linux available. And then they decided that they weren't going to do that anymore. Now, one of the obligations from the GPL is you have to make your source code available, which they still do, right? So when you buy Red Hat Linux, you can still request the source code on CD. Now, because it's GPL, you are within your rights to now share that to everyone else. But what Red Hat did, which upset everyone, was that they changed their terms of contract. They used lawyers to very carefully articulate that if you do that, we may not give you access to your Red Hat account again. So and there's actually nothing wrong with that. It's not in the spirit of open source, but there's nothing that says open source you can't do that, because that's a separate construct, right? I've got a legal, I've got a commercial relationship with this company versus the open source. I mean, I don't have any strong opinions. I don't think it was other than it was not done in the spirit of open source, but that's their business, right? I mean, I can't really comment on their business. I think it's definitely an opportunity for Linux distros, though, for sure.
Ricardo, thanks for the presentation. I'm Dave from Australian Tenders. My multinational dev team builds in Docker locally, and we deploy our staging and production workloads using Docker ECS.
Oh yeah.
Now being orphaned by Docker, how do I get AWS to adopt the project?
So the project that you're using is what called?
Docker ECS or Compose ECS.
Oh, Compose. So John Preston's project.
John Preston.
So if it's the same project, so ECS Compose X is a project that AWS Community Builder in the UK works for Sainsbury's, and basically it's a command line tool to deploy containers using CloudFormation. I think it's.
We deploy into ECS from Fargate using Docker Compose file.
Yeah, that's it, and then use that tool. So it is a brilliant tool. John is actively developing it, and so the question is, do you want AWS to own it?
No, they've got a repo, but they've said it's here. We've extracted it. It's ready for somebody else to maintain it. It makes sense if it's Docker to ECS for AWS to somehow sponsor that group.
Right.
It's open source. I've got some.
So I think it's a separate project then. So because the project that I'm thinking of, which might be different, is ECS Compose X.
I think I know the one.
Yeah, and
related, but
yeah, they're related, and I think that he's doubling down on his project because of that deprecation, right?
I'll look them up.
So and he's great. So I have regular communication. He will be delighted that you have asked about this question, because he built that project specifically for this purpose. And he was a bit worried initially because when Copilot was created by us, that helped to do all the ECS stuff, he thought that was going to take interest away from his project, but it hasn't. So he's definitely keeping ECSX going. In fact, actually, so he is tomorrow. I think is the London Summit tomorrow? I think so. London Summit tomorrow. He is on the open source demo booth, the first demo person.
Quick to the airport.
Yeah. Good luck with that one. Yeah, sorry. Any other questions?
So how does CentOS case related to Red Hat, related to Steve's question? Is that because of CLA?
So I don't know that one well enough. Interestingly though, Rich Bowen, who was at the heart of that, he now works in our team. But it was complicated. I don't know the story, so I can't really answer that. But if you're interested, then we've got Rich Bowen is the guy you need to speak to. I'll see if I can drag him out to Australia.
The other question I have is how about Oracle Linux adoption in AWS? Can I get it natively in the SOE, like Ubuntu, Amazon Linux?
So I don't know about Oracle Linux at all. I know it exists because I used it in my previous organisation, but I did it once and never came back to it. Not because it was bad, but because it didn't really do anything special or different that I needed. So I don't really have an answer for them on that one.
Just around the generative AI stuff, was it the US court that you said that?
No, the US Copyright Office. So they are the legal jurisdiction owner of intellectual property in the US. But the reason why it's interesting is because when they say something, then everyone in the US listens, and then other countries who based off US copyright law listen as well. So it has this ripple effect. So, and this happened last year. And what was interesting is it happened not once but twice, because the initial finding, which happened I think a year before, was challenged. They came out and they reinforced the finding. So, but the thing is, though, this is such a hot potato. It wouldn't surprise me if a consortium of people then challenged it. But
because like the like Windows XP, that all of that source is freely available. I could potentially like run it through just like a generative AI and just it would modify it, and then I could just be like, that's mine. You know, like,
but it wouldn't be yours though, would it? Because you can't copyright it.
Well, oh, yeah, true. But like it's open source, you know, like
it's not even open source because you can't apply a license to it.
Oh,
so that's the point, is that you can't apply a license to it because by definition it can't be copyrighted. So a key thing, you can only apply open source licenses to stuff that can be copyrighted, right? So if you can't copyright something, then you can't apply an open source license to it, and therefore you can't protect it. So yeah.
Just a quick question about those 4 pillars. One of them, open design. Can you give some examples of good open design that you've seen in your travels?
So open design is really how you structure your project to include and make available not only the development but the actual direction of your project, right? So, of course. So Apache Airflow is one. I'm trying to think of some others. So Cedar, actually. Cedar's doing a good job because what they're doing is so typically what will happen is, you start off as the owner of a project, right? And then the project grows. And then you want to figure out, well, okay, I don't want to be the only person that decides where this goes, right? So the process you do is you raise an issue, you call it RFC and say, I want to do X, right? So they're doing that really well. OpenSearch is another good example. OpenSearch have an open design, open governance model. They have a really good code of conduct, and they make it really easy to start development. So and OpenSearch, because it started a couple of years ago, you can actually see the whole timeline because it's all open. So you can see things like the code of conduct, the governance model, all from the first version, second version. It's all the communication is done in open. So they have a bi-weekly meeting. All the chats are made available, so you can join. Anyone can join, and they're published. So I think OpenSearch, Cedar are two good examples of where we're doing that. But there are Kubernetes I think is a great example of that, because the way they've taken such a big project and then split it out into SIGs, special interest groups, to change the direction of things like security or scaling or deployments or documentation. So that's how you take a big project and you kind of like break it down into smaller chunks and then assign a group of people to own that piece. And then within that piece, then own things like, so they have a rolling thing of like, who's going to do a release? So one person will be in charge of doing a release. They'll have a shadow, and that person will then do the next release. It's all documented, right? So actually, this is an interesting thing. So back in the day, one of the things that I used to talk to my customers when I was at PwC was that as people were beginning to get onto kind of like cloud development, cloud native, or even just modern development, right? I would say, go lurk in the open source projects, because these people are doing this. They're doing it really, really well, and it's all open, which means that you can learn a ton of stuff, right? So I was a consultant. I could charge people loads of money for this, right? And all I had to do was just lurk, take some notes, and then do a fancy presentation. So look, you can do it this way. Aren't we wonderful? We're helping you do this. Now, I would never do that, right? That's why I left the company in the end. But it's all there. It's all in the open. And it's a really good way for companies to start learning. If you feel like you don't really have the knowledge or experience, anyone can go up to these projects and start learning. So, yeah.
Thank you.
Cool.
All right, we'll wrap it up there. Round of applause for Ricardo.
Thank you.
So if there's
here's a takeaway. Please, if you're any way interested in open source, follow Ricardo. Ricardo, where's your LinkedIn?
Oh, sugar. Okay.
Ricardo's open source blog, which he mentioned, comes out every week. This guy writes a very detailed blog every week about all the projects that popped up in open source over the previous 7 days. A life goal for anybody here is to get on that blog. I've managed it twice.
You have?
Yes. Yeah, please follow Ricardo, contribute to open source, and you too can be on Ricardo's weekly blog.
I would love that, actually. I would really love that if there were people who had projects here that I didn't know about,
Yep.
and we could feature them. Absolutely. Yeah, for sure.
Thanks very much. We're done.